Well, the president this week is also focused on the devastation caused by Hurricane Harvey. It's a major test for his presidency. President Trump traveled to Texas Tuesday, where he praised the disaster response so far and promised federal help with a costly long-term recovery. Callum Borchers is a reporter for the Washington Post. He joins me now. Callum, the president promised the federal government is committed to this long-term recovery and praised the effort so far. What are the challenges, Callum, that the government faces moving forward to try and get this aid through?
Probably the biggest immediate challenge is this debt ceiling limit and whether they'll be able to get that through Congress and whether the president is serious about shutting down the government if they're not willing to fund his border wall with Mexico. I thought that at his news conference, his joint news conference with the president of Finland the other day, there was a terrific question from Todd Gilman, who is the Dallas Morning News White House correspondent, who asked him, are you worried about jeopardizing relief efforts in Texas and Louisiana based on your threat to shut down the government? And the president didn't really have a strong answer for that. He said he doesn't believe it'll come to that. But I think that that's the kind of brinksmanship that we're looking at here.
When you're talking about tax reform, which will be a big event today that he's going to be discussing, the president is meeting with the big four, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi at the White House this week. Callum, can you read into that? And does he have bipartisan support for an aid package right now?
Not yet, although it's hard to tell because we don't have a lot of details on this plan. And we're expecting today that he is going to lay out a lot of the problems, a lot of the reasons why he thinks the United States needs tax reform. But don't expect him to say these are what the tax brackets should look like. Supposedly that will be coming down the line. But I do think it's striking that he is sort of meeting with this bipartisan coalition of lawmakers, which of course is a very different approach from what he took on health care earlier. And it seems that perhaps that's one of the things he might have learned from that experience, is that it actually might be easier in some ways on major legislative projects to find some kind of middle ground than to try to appease just the Republicans. I mean, that sounds sort of crazy to say, but the Republican Party is so split right now between the Freedom Caucus on the very extreme right end and more moderate Republicans in the middle, that just getting the whole GOP on the same page might be a heavier lift than finding bipartisan common ground.
Yeah, they're definitely not a monolith. That's a good point. He didn't meet directly with any of the victims or the evacuees of the storm. Do you think the president has an empathy problem?
It's a great question. As I was reading through the coverage this morning, I saw basically a split. I sort of likened the president's image in the press today to a skilled surgeon who lacks a bedside manner. His response from the government so far has been generally well received, and yet, as you noted, he was pretty hands-off yesterday. He stayed on the periphery in Corpus Christi. He tweeted today about touring the devastation firsthand, but that's not exactly what he did. And as you mentioned, he didn't meet any victims firsthand either. I think that the empathy problem only becomes a problem if the logistics start to fall through. I think that if folks have to choose one or the other, like I would still take that skilled surgeon, even if he doesn't have a great bedside manner, if that means that he's going to do a good job in the operating room. But if the operating room is going to slip it all, I think that that's where the empathy really becomes an issue. That's
a great line and a good comparison, in fact, of bedside manner. The president's going to talk about tax reform today in Missouri. Why go forward and talk about it now when there aren't specific details? The White House has already said don't expect him to lay it out today.
I suspect he's kind of laying the groundwork for what he thinks will be a favorable plan going forward. I think that the challenge for him, of course, is that this comes on the heels of an unsuccessful attempt to reform health care. And of course, the hope was that by repealing the Affordable Care Act, you would take away some of those Obamacare taxes as well, right? And sort of give yourself a head start on tax reform. That didn't happen. So now the task is a lot more difficult going forward. I think that what he's hoping to do today is to set the tone and lay out the vision for what he hopes to accomplish at the end. But it sounds to me as if he's going to defer to the policy wonks on his staff and probably lawmakers like Paul Ryan to try to hammer out the details. And if it sort of meets with his grand vision, then he'll throw his support behind it after the fact.
Someone who is speaking out today, Senator Chuck Schumer, who laid out sort of 3 principles for Democrats on tax reform, including not increasing the burden on the middle class, going through regular order. And he also mentioned not adding to the deficit. How likely do you think the president is to actually meet any of those guidelines?
Well, as far as not increasing taxes on the middle class, that certainly aligns with what he talked about on the campaign. And in fact, I think this is one of those areas where you saw a lot of overlap between what President Trump said as a candidate and what Bernie Sanders said as a candidate. And as different as those two were in style in a lot of ways, and as different as they were on some policy matters, that sort of economic populism was an area of common ground. And so I think that that is actually a spot where you could see Democrats and Republicans, somebody like Chuck Schumer and President Trump, actually work together. Will he check all of the boxes that Chuck Schumer wants? No way. But I think that there will be some overlap there.
Callum Borchers, I hope you don't have any vacation planned, Callum, for September. It's going to be a busy month in Washington.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Callum, for joining us.